Which teams had the best offseason so far? How much have the Thunder improved? Is the Melo to the Rockets trade dead? The only question left is, say it with me, you win? Hey sports fans, Coach Nick here, and welcome to the B-Ball Breakdown Podcast. I am pleased to have an old buddy of mine on the show today, Nate Duncan, who is probably, as you already know, host of the Daily Dunked On Basketball NBA podcast and the hashtag Twitter NBA show. And Nate, a pleasure to have you back on the show. It's been too long.
Yeah, you know, you start your show so much more enthusiastically than I do. I could learn from you. You really bring the energy at the beginning. I'm just like, so we're gonna do our grades today. Like that's right. That's like my start.
Yeah. Well, you know, my voice is higher. I think that always helps. But also, I took a cold shower today. I don't know if you've heard about that, but I spoke to a bunch of NBA trainers and these guys who do all sorts of strength and conditioning. Supposedly, the cold shower is supposed to help with like your nervous system and core and all that stuff. Have you ever done that before?
I wish I had a way. Actually, Bob Voulgaris tweeted about this the other day of just putting in an ice machine like above your tub, so you can actually take like cold baths. I like after I go skiing, I like to take a cold bath because it's usually cold enough there that you can just turn on the water and it'll be like 45 degrees. But I find it difficult to do at home.
Aha. Yes. It was funny. The first 30 seconds are pretty intense, but then it actually was fine. And so I might do it again. But as a result, I feel like $1 million today, and I'm ready to go. So
I feel like $10,000.
You feel like $10,000? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I got a ways to go.
It sounds like you're still unwinding from your Vegas shenanigans.
Yeah, I mean, well, though, I probably went out one night while I was there because I was just so busy with sports business classroom. We start at 8 a.m. every day, so I'm actually didn't have that much time to really socialize after hours. But I'm ready to go here. What do you want to talk about? And
forgive me, I didn't mean to imply anything with the word shenanigans. I actually meant, Larry Kuhn. When you hang out with Larry Kuhn and talk about the CBA all day, that's shenanigans to me. So that's what it sounds like you guys were doing. But let's jump right into this. I figured you like lists, you like grades. We should talk about some of these grades. So let me throw this out there. What do you think? Who had the best offseason so far in terms of free agency and draft moves?
Yeah, it's tough to say this just because some teams just had limited opportunities. A lot of these East teams were just up against the tax; they couldn't do anything. So you always got to judge relative to where they were in terms of their opportunities. But I think clearly Oklahoma City just pulling Paul George out of their hat, then getting Patrick Patterson 3 years for the taxpayer mid-level exception. I think he was a guy who could really help them with his defensive versatility, ability to shoot the ball. And then getting Raymond Felton for the minimum to address their open sore at backup point guard that really killed them last year. I thought that they did extremely well.
So how do you explain, or maybe my head was under a rock, but like it just really felt like nobody had that on their radar that he was going to go there. And also, I'll throw this out there, it just felt like that deal would have been there weeks from that point, and they could have easily looked around and maybe found something better had they waited. But how do you explain that? Have you heard anything in the insiders as far as how they kept that so quiet until it happened?
Well, OKC is always well known for keeping stuff quiet. And, I mean, the reason nobody saw them going there is because they didn't have what anybody would have thought of as great assets, right? Even their first rounders were impacted. They had portions of their 2018 and 2020 first-round picks, so they weren't really able to trade first rounders either. And they didn't have any great young prospects on the roster who weren't making a lot of money already. And Indiana just thought that Domantas Sabonis and Victor Oladipo are really good, and I don't think most people saw it that way, including both of us.
Right. I mean, listen, well, I guess here's the question. I kind of feel like Oladipo has hit his ceiling. I think whatever he did last year, it was his career high for him, is probably going to be it. I like Sabonis, certainly, as a non-starter on a decent team. So I guess, obviously, you're favoring OKC in this deal. What grade would you give the Pacers for this?
Well, yeah, we did our Eastern Conference grades yesterday, but just for the trade itself, I would say F- for the Pacers, and we gave them an F overall. And then OKC, we gave them an A+ for the trade, and then and also they got Andre Robertson to return for reasonable money as well. I like the draft pick of Terrence Ferguson at number 21. I think he's got some two-way potential down the road. Really athletic guy, can shoot it. So I went with an A+ for them. I thought they really just to get a team that really looked like it had no way to improve. It improved very significantly.
Okay, so it still is a weird starting lineup as far as I can tell, or how the lineups are going to work out here. But I guess you're right. When you add Paul George to this team, they're obviously better, I guess. It's like where are we projecting? Where would you say they're going to be next year? What part of the conference, or what rank?
Well, I think their defense can be awesome. And so, who do we think they're going to start? I guess you have to wonder who they're going to start at the 4. Patterson has always come off the bench. I think some people are projecting that he's going to start. Maybe Jeremy Grant could get into that mix. If it were me, I would probably go with Westbrook, then either Abrines or Doug McDermott, Paul George, and then actually play Robertson at the 4, because that way you can minimize his lack of shooting if you're going to and play him more really as kind of like a role guy, have Steven Adams in the dunker spot on a lot of these plays. But I think it'll be interesting to see how they go at the 4 and where they find space for Abrines and McDermott, because I think you almost got to start one of those guys, because playing them together defensively on the second unit is difficult to do as well. And maybe they bring Patterson off the bench, and then they'll have a lot of options to close. They could go with a switchier lineup. They could play like Patterson, Jeremy Grant, Robertson, and Paul George and Westbrook. I mean, that would be a really interesting lineup with just a ton of athleticism. And that's why I like them, really, because I think they just have so much athleticism. It wouldn't surprise me if defensively they are the team in the league that can give Golden State the most trouble, just because of their athletes, in somewhat similar fashion to the way they did in the 2016 conference finals.
Okay, I mean, I can follow that, but you can still see why I have a little bit of pause, right, as far as when you start looking at what you're suggesting as far as starting like McDermott or Abrines. It's like, I don't know, but then again, if you put them on the bench and bring them off the bench, then you're talking about playing them alongside Enes Kanter as well. That doesn't work either. So it's an interesting thing. I think the answer is Patrick Patterson. I think they have to start him. Which is a little bit. I guess that's
coaches have always had like this mind block against starting him, though, and like he'll start for 5 games and then not be good, and they're like, oh, he doesn't have the mentality to start. We got to bring him off the bench.
Yeah, I think this is going to be the time they do it, because we know that. Well, I don't know. Paul George doesn't necessarily want to play power forward. And I guess, okay, so then if you want to have Robertson play that as a really small power forward, I don't know. It's confusing to me is all I'm going to say. But you're right. The bottom line is they finished, where did they finish last year? What rank did they finish?
47 and 35, and they were the 7th seed, right? No, I'm sorry, 6th seed. They played against the Rockets, who are the 3 seed, but they're starting from really a lower point than that, because they had pretty much an even point differential, and they really got lucky with some of the heroics that Russell Westbrook had, where he would score the last 15 points of the game and bring them back out. Know that you can rely on that. So I'm thinking of them as kind of starting from being a 500 team, but adding Patterson and Paul George really, I think, gets you up there. And I like the playoffs too, because they can put lineups out there that are just extremely hard to attack defensively. Even Russ, I know people really don't like his pick and roll defense, and I agree, it's been really bad. I mean, he had in the 2016 playoffs, he had one of the worst pick and roll defense games by a point guard I've ever seen in that game 2 against Dallas, when Raymond Felton just killed him. But he can switch. And so if they're going to be switching everything, he's really strong in the post. He takes it personally when guys try to back him down. So he's not someone that you can just get a switch and go at in the post. So to be able to have that type of athleticism potentially across all 5 positions is something that I think could be really difficult for a lot of teams to deal with.
Yeah, I can follow that. And by the way, my issue with Russ is his off-ball defense. That's what really kills me. But then again, it doesn't really come back to haunt him unless he's playing a team like the Warriors. It's like the only team that's going to move him around a lot on that weak side. So that is an interesting take. And you can argue, I suppose, that with the addition of Patrick Patterson and Paul George, he does a little bit less on offense, and maybe he'll have a little bit more energy on defense and focus there. So, yeah, I mean, you're right. It's interesting. They could be the same spot they were last year, or they can improve, I would say a couple spots. And that kind of throws everything off because I don't think anyone was counting on them to be part of this Western Conference mix. I'm not even sure if it matters as we look at the top of the conference, because the Warriors, I mean, I had been saying, and I think Dave and I have been saying this together, that it kind of feels like they had the best moves of anybody, which is patently unfair.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's hard to say they had the best moves of anybody because, I mean, Houston got Chris Paul. I mean, they didn't add a player of that caliber. But when you consider where they were in terms of the cap, I mean, they basically were able to re-sign everybody. Joe Lacob was willing to pay, and with the help of Kevin Durant taking about a $9 million discount from what the max would have been. And then they replaced guys who I thought were the weak links for them in Ian Clark, who I thought was kind of an overrated guy. He signed in New Orleans. They replaced him with Nick Young, more size, better shooter, more athletic, improved defensively last year. Caspi, using him to replace Matt Barnes. I think he's one of the most underrated players in the league, getting him for the minimum, a guy who could play the four, shoot with very deep kind of Ryan Anderson range. They're going to find a use for that as well. And see who else. And then Jordan Bell replacing McAdoo. I think McAdoo was someone that Kerr loved to play, who really wasn't any good, and so they needed someone else who. And you never want to rely on a rookie, obviously, but they needed someone else who can be a switch guy defensively at center, because they would, against like some of the best teams like Cleveland, when they wouldn't play Green at center, they would just get killed. So now they have an option there as well, a guy who can block shots and be versatile. So I'm really impressed with what they did. And they didn't lose anybody important. That's incredible.
Oh yeah, and that's the thing. Like, when you really thought about it, after the starters, there really wasn't much shooting besides Ian Clark. And now you can bring in Nick Young and Omri Caspi, two guys that could shoot it. And so they suddenly have like more shooting, which is crazy. Patrick McCaw, by the way, I know you probably saw him in Summer League a little bit too, but I did. And I even pulled him aside and said, like, I don't know if you realize it, but he's got like the glow. I mean, the guy was playing point guard and running the show. He was doing his Clay imitation, running to the wing and nailing threes in transition. He was defending. I mean, this is the guy who I think makes it really unfair.
Yeah, I liked him, and it helps actually that they have all these other guys. I mean, I think there may be a little frustration when we see Nick Young playing more than him, because I think in a lot of circumstances he's going to be better than Young, but he's going to be a free agent, and he's going to be a restricted free agent coming up. And so the fact that all these guys will be playing over him, maybe that depresses his value, and they can get him for cheaper going forward as well. So I really think it's going to be – and now like guys like Iguodala, Sean Livingston, even Durant, they've got so much depth on the wing. I mean, Caspi and Nick Young, to me, are guys who can defend their position okay and shoot on the wing. I mean, how many guys like that are even out there in free agency? And for the Warriors to get those two guys, now KD, if they need to rest Draymond, that they can. And so I think they'll be really in great shape going into the playoffs, not having to play their guys that many minutes.
Yeah, and I would have laughed in your face if you had said Nick Young could guard his position reasonably well before last year. But I can tell you, having watched the Lakers here, a number of times, like a whole bunch of games, he was like giving out on defense. He was in his stance. He was moving the direction. He was really playing well. And I think the beauty of that situation is that Steve Kerr can just simply call up. He can call up Luke Walton and be like, Luke, what did you say to him? Let me have some of those words, because clearly it worked. And I think that's another underlooked connection that they have there. That like Steve Kerr and Luke Walton have this connection. They could share notes, I suppose.
Yeah, and it'll be a boon, of course, for media members covering the Warriors as well. That Nick Young will be there. Yes,
I can imagine. Yeah, I mean, that whole team is filled with guys who are good interviews. I think it's safe to say, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the top guy is Draymond, right?
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, I'm not that interested in interviewing guys like they just say like controversial stuff. Like to me, I'm not as into that stuff. But for people who the aggregators will have a good time with the Warriors this year, I'm sure.
Right. Hey, don't knock the aggregators. You never know.
I don't knock the aggregators. I get my news from them, and my buddy Dan Feldman is one of the best there. I mean, like I like the ones who can find something and then actually add some good analysis on it. Like those, that's who I like to read.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a cottage industry, and we shouldn't knock it. So, okay, so we have the Warriors now like firmly ensconced for at least another few years as the prohibitive favorites to win the championship every year. Someone asked me on Twitter earlier today, and I really didn't have an answer necessarily, was who is best positioned, and I'm not even saying that they have a chance, but who is best positioned to beat the Warriors next year?
Oh, man.
Right?
I mean, all right, so who are the candidates here? Cleveland. Still, we'll see what happens with KYRIE. I think it's possible, actually, despite the utter incompetence that they've shown this offseason so far, that if they make the right KYRIE trade, it would be bad for the long-term future of the franchise. I don't think they're going to get a player who's as young as he is with as much upside as he is. But I think they could get players who are more versatile in trade for him that actually would help them match up a little bit better defensively against the Warriors, and then hope that LeBron James can help carry them home against them. So maybe there's still a chance that they could actually be better for trading KYRIE, at least this year, or the future, maybe not. So we'll see where they end up there. Houston, I like what they did. I mean, obviously getting Paul, he's another one of these guys too, a point guard who can switch a little bit. And then with Ariza, PJ Tucker, Luka Mbamute, Tarek Black is a guy who at least has some mobility defensively at center. Clint Capella. They've got at least some lineups that, I mean, you're never, even your best lineups, even if you can have people who can switch across all 5 positions, the Warriors have so many good one-on-one guys, they're still going to score. But they could come pretty close to putting out some defensive lineups that at least like don't have too many weak points, other than, of course, James Harden.
I can kind of see that also, although I kind of still feel like those games in a playoff series would still be 126 to 122 or whatever, which is not bad. That could be pretty fun.
Yeah, although, I mean, the problem, too, is that I think, like, if you're Tucker, I mean, you saw that series against the Bucks in particular last year. I thought, Tucker was taking, like, 2 shots a game and playing 30 minutes, and, like, the Warriors will punish you if you're going to have a guy like that. And then in Mbamute even more so. So if you're going to play those guys together, and Ryan Anderson really probably can't play against the Warriors' best units, so you start to run into some problems there about maybe scoring with your off-ball guys not needing to be guarded because, two-way guys on the wing, you just, with the resources they had available, tough to get. But I thought still they did well to at least be able to throw some good offensive or defensive lineups out there. It's just, I think one side of the court may always suffer outside of having Paul and Harden, who of course are awesome.
Well, so does Melo? First of all, I guess I'm not even sure Melo moves the needle, but it doesn't feel like there is a path to getting him on the Rockets at this point. Does it? Is there?
No, it doesn't, because think about it from Houston. So let's say you didn't have to give up anything, right? If you're Houston.
Okay.
How much would you be willing to trade for Melo? He's making basically $27 million the next 2 years. Let's say you could just send out kind of neutral salary to get him. How many draft picks would you be willing to give up to get him? Would you 1 first-round pick, 2 first-round picks? Like what is he worth in trade?
Well, Ryan Anderson's got a contract that's somewhere in the ballpark, right? Is he 20?
Right. Yeah, well, so I mean, where I'm going here is, he almost certainly would have to be traded, and to trade him, the reporting from Zach Lowe, among others, has said that it would take 2 first-round draft picks to get off that salary. He's owed $20 million basically over the next 3 seasons, and so you're basically saying, and then that doesn't even account for the fact that the Knicks will theoretically want something back. You're gonna have to send Anderson to a 3rd team because the Knicks don't want Anderson's salary. So you're going to have to give up 2 first-round picks to get rid of Anderson. Then you also got to give the Knicks something. I don't know that Melo is worth something, but the Knicks seem to expect that he is.
Sure.
So now, I mean, trading 2 first-round picks and something else for Carmelo Anthony, who, as you mentioned, probably doesn't really move the needle for them. No, I don't think that makes sense. So I anticipate that Anthony will end up getting bought out at some point.
Well, here's what doesn't make any sense to me. Why the Knicks wouldn't want to – I don't know why they don't want Anderson. They would be able to shed salary. They could get draft picks and take Anderson back.
He goes a year longer, though, is the problem, than Anthony.
Okay.
So you're putting another $20 million on, and when Kristaps Porzingis would be a restricted free agent in the summer of 2019, they might want to use cap space that year, and now you've got Anderson on the books for another $20 million. It would make that pretty difficult.
Okay,
so I mean,
yeah. It's that one last year is the problem, is what you're saying. If it timed out better, they would probably take him.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if it were just, hey, take some draft picks, take Anderson, and we reduce our salary commitment a little bit now because Anderson makes less than Melo does. Yeah, I think it's that fourth year that really is the issue.
Okay. Now, is there a time, if they wanted to buy Anderson out, is there a time limit to that? Or like they can't do it for X amount of time?
Oh, you're talking about the Knicks?
Yeah, what if they did take – because they're going to buy out Melo. It would probably be more expensive than to buy out Anderson.
Yeah, I mean, buying people out almost invariably doesn't save you that much money. I mean, for example, Jamal Crawford got traded to the Hawks, right? And so he was due $14 million this year and $3 million next year, and the Hawks were able to save about $3 million off of that $17 million to buy him out. That's usually about – you're probably not going to save more than at most 20% of what the guy is owed in a buyout, and that's only if that guy in particular has like more lucrative options. Like Crawford, for example, knew that he had $4 million waiting for him in Minnesota when he got bought out, so he was willing to take a little bit less. With Anderson, I mean, and I agree he can play. It wouldn't be bad having him, although he and Porzingis in a defensive front court would be interesting. But I don't think that they could say, hey, we have a way to get off of this $20 million without giving up assets. And he's 29 now. He's only going to get older and slower as time goes on.
Okay. Well, speaking of, so we got through that, the Rockets, and I agree that they're definitely going to be a challenge, but we kind of overlooked the Spurs for a minute there, which is what happens every year. And so, the interesting thing about that game one that we saw before Kawhi got hurt was they were hammering them. And I think the question now is was it equal parts rustiness on the Warriors having not played for a week? Does that rustiness usually only last for like a first half, and then they were still getting killed in the third quarter, so that wasn't rustiness? So, what are your thoughts? And also, what are your thoughts on their offseason moves? Because they didn't really do much either.
Yeah, I didn't care for their offseason, but I think that the Spurs' performance in that game one is a little overrated. They definitely killed them in that first game, but for the first half. But the Warriors just weren't running anything good. Ultimately, when the Warriors, they love to move the ball around and play the beautiful game. I think that's very important for their culture to do that. But I think they maybe ran 4 Steph Curry pick and rolls in the first half of that game, and just did not involve the Spurs' slow centers defensively at all out in the perimeter. They weren't doing actions to require them to defend out there. And then the Spurs the defense was real bad. And then in that third quarter, I mean, it was only about a 4-minute period. But if you go back and watch the film of that, the Spurs made 3 ridiculous shots. And there was one play where John Simmons hit a contested 3 in the corner with 1 on the shot clock. Another one where someone fell down and just the ball kind of squirted to a guy at the top and he hit a 3 with the shot clock winding down. So the Warriors were already in the midst of coming back on them at that point before the Kawhi injury. So I don't think that it would have made that big of a difference. I still think the Warriors probably wouldn't have won that game one, but I still think it would have been, a 5 or 6 game series with Kawhi. And then as for their off-season moves, that Gasol contract is absolutely miserable. I mean, and I guess to get him to opt out and get some flexibility, they maybe had to promise that they would do this for him. But to not get Chris Paul, and to take on a bunch of extra money, I thought I loved what they would be able to do in the summer of 2018 when there's going to be some pretty good free agents and not as many teams are going to have space. But then they really committed a lot of money, and I think they're worse this year than they were last year anyway, having lost Simmons and Dedmon, yeah.
Yeah, it's really we complained all year long why they didn't play Dedmon more, because when he did, they were better. And who knows? Maybe he wasn't practicing hard and all those different things that we never know about, which is, Pop had a reason for not doing it. But yeah, I think it really, really killed them, because they certainly need athletes. And Dedmon and
they're going to win 55 to 60 games this year. They'll do that all the time during the regular season. But yeah, I mean, they lost maybe, Simmons was easily one of their 5 best guys against the Warriors, and they lost him. And, unless they're counting on Brandon Paul to replace him, a guy I'm not that familiar with, maybe they can make him into the next Simmons. But expecting them to guard the Warriors, I don't see how it happens.
Right, and then you have to wonder if is Javonte Murray ready, because it doesn't seem like they're going to rely. You can't rely on Tony Parker anymore. I don't think they want Patty Mills starting. So that's an interesting conundrum. What did you think about Murray? He had a pretty rough first start, I thought, in the playoffs, and rightfully so. The kid didn't have any experience there. Did you think he turned it around enough to see some glimpses into something that might be viable going into next year?
Yeah, it was ridiculous that they started him. And then when they changed up to start Mills and bring him off the bench, he was better. I think he really is at the point now he can't shoot at all. So if you're expecting him to run a pick and roll, you're probably going to be disappointed. He really failed running pick and roll in Summer League. I think he had 10 points on 28 possessions or something like that as trying to score out of the pick and roll. And he was 0 for 3 on threes in 4 games. So he's not even taking them, much less making them. I thought he has good instincts getting to the basket. On a closeout, if you're not guarding him, he can kind of go by the guy and shoot a floater or get to the rim. And I think he's got some hope defensively. But no, I mean, I'm not ready to rely on him as a high-level rotation contributor in the playoffs at this point.
Yeah, and we would be remiss if we didn't mention they do have a couple guys in their team that are newer that they signed. Rudy Gay, coming off of Achilles surgery, which is one of those things you never know. But we certainly haven't seen recently anybody come back very quickly from that. It still hurts me when I watch Wes Matthews run, even though he was somewhat effective recently. They also have Joffrey Laverne, who's a guy who I'm really intrigued with, and I thought I've seen moments. And then also Bertans. I've also been very intrigued by these guys, and I almost feel like, those guys could come in and really, plug some holes as well.
Yeah, during the regular season, I think you're right. Danny, by the way, Laverne is the guy that he dislikes watching the most in the whole league. It's kind of funny actually that you mentioned him. I mean, I think offensively he's got some skills. He's got that flat shot that he can make from the corners from 3. He get into a righty or lefty hook or around the rim. But defensively, I think he's a major problem. The Spurs have had success getting stuff out of guys like that in the regular season, just within the team system. You never would have thought that Gasol or David Lee could be reasonably effective defensively the way they were last year during the regular season. And Bertans I like a little bit more. I think he's a guy who has underrated athleticism and a guy that they call a wetter, can shoot from the perimeter, and it's going down most of the time. So I think he's someone who could play a little bit more. But I think you mentioned the Gay signing. My hope for them always was, hey, they got to play smarter. They got to have more of a combo forward type at the 4. They got to play Kawhi at the 4. Maybe it'll be Gay if he's able to return. They got a good medical staff there. But to just get more versatile defensively and get more shooting on the floor, because the 2 traditional bigs that Pop loves to doing that against the Warriors or against Houston for that matter, I really just don't think that could be effective.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a second.
At least this Houston team.
Okay, right, because you're right. There are probably combinations of 2 almost traditional bigs that would hurt. So I guess that's the question: is that dead and gone? I can go through and I'm still can find some lineups that people are running a lot of that have 2 traditional bigs. Because isn't the notion of destroying them on the offensive boards, I feel like we've gone away so far from that in an effort to get back on defense that we've forgotten that there is a value of creating multiple possessions in a row. And I feel like is that going to be slow? Is that going to become extinct, or is someone going to finally go in there and they're going to get they're going to average 18 offensive rebounds a game and really change the complexion?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of the teams that play with 2 traditional bigs, Utah is probably going to do that this year. The Spurs, as you mentioned, they are actually Utah comes out of the Spurs system with Quinn Snyder, Dennis Lindsey. The Spurs are one of the foremost teams in terms of getting back, although you will see on occasion against the Warriors, they really will hit the offensive glass, and they've hurt them on the offensive glass at times last year. But yeah, that is an interesting thought. But I think just in general, I mean, if you think about all the times that you go to the offensive glass, I mean, you're the best offensive rebound rate that you're ever going to have as a team is probably in today's NBA, it'd probably be like 30%, right?
Okay.
And even if you only send one guy there, you probably get like 20% offensive rebounds. So you're basically your window there is 10% of possessions. You might get an offensive rebound, and then you have a higher chance of scoring on that. That's maybe, you score 60% of the time, say, on those 10% of possessions. But then if you're sending another guy to crash every single time to get that extra 10%, if you're going to give up a fast break, 50% more often, because I don't know exactly what those numbers are. People with access to SportView could tell you this, but if you're going to give up a fast break 50% of the time and only get the offensive rebound 10% of the time, whatever that number is, whether it's 50% or whatever, it doesn't really seem to work out that well for a lot of teams, because transition, especially with three-point shooting as well, and semi-transition is just so powerful these days.
Now, okay, so that is right. That is the point. I think in the traditional 20 years ago mindset, when no one is running to the three-point line on the fast break, it might be more reasonable to trade that. And that's probably what, I mean, if you would go back and look at the numbers, if we ever had SportView back in the 80s, you probably would see that like you could mitigate a lot of the fast breaking that people are getting twos and whatever.
Well, actually, I mean, in the 80s, they had a lot more fast breaking than they do today. I mean, like getting back on defense just wasn't as important. Teams just didn't run as hard. Teams just generally didn't play as hard in the 80s, I think, as they do now, because you just have to cover so much more ground than you did back then. Like if you go back and watch film, I mean, everyone's playing within 15 feet of the basket. You don't have these plays where it's like, all right, I got to crash in from the perimeter all the way to the basket, tag the roll guy, and then sprint out 25 feet to the three-point line. Like you didn't have to give that level of effort defensively.
But also, we had much more of a mindset in the 80s to go after the offensive rebounds. So naturally, right, we'd have more fast breaking from that as well, which is interesting. So the numbers bear that out, that there was more fast breaking in the 80s than there is now?
I'm pretty sure that's the case. I think they played it at a faster pace, but that's more me just watching film from back then as well, where it just – they really pushed it. There wasn't as much of an emphasis on getting back. And a lot of times they would get the offensive rebound, but then if you didn't get the offensive board, you had – because I always felt that the key to transition defense is actually getting your bigs back, because if you've got a guy who's like a really good transition point guard, like a Derrick Rose back in the day, or LeBron or Westbrook, if you just have guards back, like that's not going to help you. They're just going to go right through those guys. You got to have a big who's in position to actually like deter someone from getting to the rim in transition.
That's another great point, which is why, good rebounding guards are, in fact, maybe that should be the next sort of frontier, is that we the point guards are the guys who should be trained to go try and get offensive rebounds more.
I've thought of that too. Yeah. Or your three man, then you say, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to have one big, his job is just to get back immediately. Maybe we have our center, and then if you have like a guy who's in the corner, the opposite corner, when a shot goes up, maybe, your three man, he just sprints in, gets a running start, and kind of on the way to getting back on defense, you got to get back to the center of the court anyway. So you might as well just kind of run in, see if you can get into rebounding position, and then sprint back, because guys are not really as trained to box out as they used to be. And if you get a running start, you can really like get up and get some tip dunks or get on the offensive glass. Yeah,
and by the way, let's just say you did that a little bit, and then also hit the point guard, get in there too for any kind of, mid-range rebound that comes out. If they don't get it, you could trap right away. And like, who knows? Maybe at the very least you slow the ball going out a little bit, and maybe you get a turnover, and then that becomes a whole bunch of numbers where, 2 out of 10 times maybe you get the steal versus 4 out of 10 times you give up a good shot in the transition. I don't know, but I'm curious to see, because I just feel like the offensive rebounding thing, there's got to be a way to get back to some sort of emphasis on that where it could help you. But you're right. As far as the numbers that you quoted before, it very quickly looks like it isn't worth a consistent risk.
And that's just me eyeballing it. Like, I don't want someone to say, okay, this is the exact percentage. Like, I don't know exactly what that is. But I do think that teams that have looked at it with the SportView data, you can very easily come up with an empirical answer to that. And the smartest teams for a long time have not gone to the offensive glass. But this is a point that Ben Falk made, and it's also research in college, is just that basically almost always height correlates with better defense, and that going with two bigs, even if they're not necessarily bigs that you would think of as great defenders, having more height around the basket, playing a traditional four, that's really more to help your defense. And Tom Thibodeau certainly sees it that way with the signing of Taj Gibson this year. And so you may be worse on offense, but generally, I mean, again, unless you're playing against a team like the Warriors or maybe Houston that just has so much shooting and so much ball handling that you just can't play a traditional big, generally those lineups seem to do better defensively and not as well offensively due to the lack of spacing. For sure.
And shout out to Ben Falk. Ben Falk, write for us. Please write for us. Anyway, he's perfectly happy, I guess, writing on his own site. And boy, I would love to see him get more stuff because he's really good. So let's talk about any other surprises. Any team that you feel like has gone under the radar that no one's talking about that's going to have a surprising year for you?
That's an interesting thought. Who will have a surprising year? We talk about everything so much here.
Yeah, I have the answer if you want it.
Oh yeah, let's hear. Who are you thinking of?
The answer is Denver, isn't it?
Yeah. See, that's just not a surprise to me. I mean, I think they for at least for us NBA dorks, we knew that they had one of the best offenses in the league when they started starting Jokic last year, and then they added Paul Millsap. So, I mean, I think and they've got a lot of young talent that presumably is going to improve. So, I mean, what do you think they're going to be? You think they can get into, are you talking about them getting into the top 5 in the West or just making the playoffs?
I think they're going to screw around with a lot of this, a lot of what people have been, assuming is going to happen, because if you look at it this way, okay, the top 8 teams that made it last year, obviously Denver didn't make it, and I think they're a lock to make the playoffs this year, so that means someone's dropping down. And then you look at some of the other people that are going to improve. I mean, can you imagine Minnesota not making the playoffs?
No, I think they would have to, even though I don't really like the fit offensively of a lot of the pieces they have.
So who are the 2 teams that are dropping out who are going to be pretty sad?
Well, obviously Utah and the Clippers, with the guys they lost, are candidates for that. Memphis as well is a team that, especially with their health concerns, they're a year older. Parsons, I'm not counting on getting anything from him. So they're another team that, again, always seems to not have the greatest point differential, although they consistently seem to outperform it. But I mean, those 3 teams I think I would look at as the ones that'll be in the greatest potential difficulty.
That's interesting. So the 4th and the 5th, who you would imagine would be relatively safe as far as making the playoffs the next year, although the Clippers did. We can talk about that for a second. Oh, and the Jazz, both, I guess, right. They both went through some roster turmoil. So I guess it's possible the Jazz could fall 4 places down. It's a long drop, but I guess they could do it. I'm intrigued by the Clippers, though. They did some really interesting moves. And I don't know. I feel like they might have a shot to stay where they were at the very least.
Well, I mean, I don't see them being – I see them well below Minnesota and OKC at this point. I think if things go well health-wise, I mean, Blake Griffin, there have been dueling reports on whether he's actually going to be ready to start the season. And considering that this is an injury that he suffered in April, I mean, anytime you're going to be out for 6 months with an injury and you have the injury history that he has, you're relying on explosiveness. You have to wonder both whether he's going to actually be available and then how good he'll be. Danilo Gallinari just broke his hand, obviously punching a guy in the face, but another guy who's pretty injury prone. I mean, if those guys can give you 70 games each, then yeah, I think they might be a decent shot at the playoffs. We don't know what they're going to get out of Teodosic either. I'm really interested to see where they end up defensively, because Chris Paul actually was great for them, and Gallo, not really an adequate defensive option at the 3 anymore. Teodosic, Lou Williams, those guys are awful defenders, but they also have Beverly and DeAndre Jordan, who's a quality defender. So how does that all mix together? Do the good elements or the bad elements of their defense win out? I think they should be able to score reasonably well with some of the personnel they have.
Now you just bummed me out, because I thought I had some irrational exuberance going on, and now you're
they'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah,
I'll give them that, but I think they're just the injuries are the biggest concern for me. Although, I mean, you're not the only one. I think Kevin Pelton, some of his projections show them actually being a lot better than people think that they might be. But I don't. I mean, I think just they don't have as much talent to me as Minnesota or OKC.
That is true, and Doc will have to do some of that coaching thing as well to make this squeeze some stuff out of them. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But yeah, you're speaking some truth, and I recognize all those things. And so I like, from my point of view in the offseason, I tend to just sort of assume people are going to be healthy. I don't know. I kind of just want to ignore any kind of injury issues in the past, just hoping that maybe whoever it is has figured it out. I guess it's not the best way to do it, huh?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of GMs are in that same boat, and sometimes you have to do that, right? Like if you took Memphis from last year, right? Chandler Parsons was coming off a knee surgery that was more severe actually than we thought at the time. He actually had another meniscus repair, and he's had a lot of issues. But for Memphis, they had this cap space. It was going to go away as soon as they signed Mike Conley because he had a low capital, and then they had to sign him to the max. They didn't really have any flexibility to do anything else. Parsons had the most upside of any free agent that they could sign. And so it's like, hey, you know what? We realize there's probably a 50% chance that this guy's not going to be healthy. That's how it turned out. But they signed him because, hey, we have these good players. This is the only guy we can add. We've got to do it. And you got to roll the dice. And I think that's what the Clippers did. I would have liked to have seen them just completely rebuild. They got some good assets in that Paul trade that they could have moved, maybe try to trade DeAndre Jordan, really bottom out this year and try to use some cap space, get some assets going forward. Mm-hmm. But that, I think, with Steve Ballmer, Doc Rivers, that's not their mentality. They're trying to get this new arena, as you know, in LA. So I don't think they felt like that's something that they could do. Yeah, well, and I agree. They've been better off doing that. But you're right. That's when all the other ancillary things that come into play when you don't oftentimes realize the motivations. And so, well, one little quick shout out. I mean, Memphis, I do like. Again, I'm going to assume that Chandler Parsons is going to be healthy and have the kind of production that he had been promising for all these years. They did very nicely, with who they've added and what they've done to this team. Right, wouldn't you say? I liked what they did. I thought that Ben McLemore was a decent risk. He's someone, John Hollinger, one of their executives, when he was writing in the public sphere, he introduced this concept of a second draft where guys who, like McLemore, who have talent, flame out in their rookie contracts, and then there's a chance to get them and maybe rehabilitate them a little bit. They still got to get JaMychal Green back, though. He's a restricted free agent, hasn't signed yet. So, I mean, if we assume if he comes back, that's good. And Tyreek Evans, to just give someone who can do more off the dribble. You mentioned that Parsons, I think either one of Evans or Parsons hopefully will be healthy at one time and give them someone else who can attack off the bounce in addition to Conley. So I think given their limited resources, again, they're not a team that's really willing to pay the tax that they did okay. Yeah, and I like Dylan Brooks. It's kind of confusing to me why his stock dropped so low, but I think he can do a lot of things for them, and it's a good situation. Really quickly about the Ben McLemore thing, the rehabilitation word is exactly right, because I had been in some of those practices, and I had seen how Boogie treated him, and I know Ben McLemore a little bit, and I could sense that he's the kind of guy that's going to be affected by that every day over time. And it was really sad because the kid can shoot. He's got beautiful mechanics, but shooting is a lot of it is mental. And if you're in your head stuck there, it's really hard to be a productive player. So it feels to me like he will be that guy that's going to be rehabbed and really remind us that he was worthy of a top 5 pick. Number 7 in the 2013 draft. You know what I mean? Like it's for a guy like that, I think that's huge. And I feel like if he can get into the right in a positive setting without a teammate that's screaming at him every day, I think he'll do a lot better. Well, and also I think if they have some more creators on this team, he's got nice rise on his jump shot. If he can just concentrate on taking spot ups, and then he's got the athleticism to defend. Maybe if he's in a better defensive culture, that he can contribute more on that end. For sure. Well, the culture is still there with the grit and grind, and so I would expect him to do well. And you know what? This culture has been great for this podcast. Certainly, we ran through, I mean, this must be a record. I don't think we've ever gone through this many teams in this much detail in this short a time. Nate, really great stuff. Hey, a pleasure coming on. Happy to do it. Yeah. And in case, you have your own little podcast going on there. People might not know about it. Dunked on Basketball. You can check it out there as well. It's always, I'm sure everyone who's listened to mine has listened to yours before mine. So great work on that side. I'll be sure to check out what you're doing. Anything exciting coming up at the end between now and the start of the season for you guys? Well, we're just doing previews of all 30 teams, and I have someone on from each local market and just talk about each team for 45 minutes in the type of depth we tried to do today. So I always look forward to that. It's a great way to wrap my head around, what really is these off seasons are going to mean for these teams on the court, and then get into doing some predictions and set the stage for the season.
Absolutely. Well, I hope to see you in the next near future at some point, probably around training camp. I'll run into you up in the Bay Area. And again, thanks, Nate, for coming on. And don't forget, sports fans, at B-Ball Breakdown, we're not a channel, we're a conversation. You in? Are you in, Nate?
Absolutely.